Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. I know a lot of us don't like to think back to those dark days of 2020, particularly as the pandemic first came upon us and then the lockdowns followed with mandates and closures and arrests. And well, the bottom line is Idaho officials were complicit in many of those missteps, if we can call them that. I've got details about what a legislative task force found out when they looked at the issue to see if anything of a inconsistent nature had taken place. You'll want to hear what they found.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. You know, I don't like to open bad memories or go back and revisit difficult times. But in the case of how Idaho officials, and I'm talking from the governor on down, responded to the COVID pandemic back in 2020, this is an issue that needs to be revisited. And in fact, some hard questions need to be asked and were asked as a legislative task force met recently to talk about what the state did, what it got right, and what it got wrong. So I'm going to share with you some reactions from a couple of different news sources, as well as a few of the legislators who were tasked with looking at what took place and some of the lessons that we can draw from it. I'm going to tell you, though, right from the beginning, never again is the phrase that needs to be sticking in our minds that if somebody made an honest mistake, okay, great. How do we keep that from ever happening again? I don't think we were left with any clear answers, at least not so far, at least with the outcome of what these legislators found. So here's the headline from BoiseStatePublicRadio.org. State lawmakers, Idaho violated the Constitution during the pandemic. That makes it sound like the whole state did it. Was it all of us? Was it you? Was it me? No, it was people in positions of authority in Idaho. So a more correct headline would be something like Idaho officials, Idaho authorities violated Constitution during pandemic, because I assure you it wasn't me and very likely wasn't you either. Here are some excerpts from that article, though. The state of Idaho violated its citizens' constitutional rights during the first few weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to a new legislative task force. Shutting down churches, closing many businesses, ordering a statewide quarantine were just a few of the ways lawmakers found the state crossed the Idaho and U.S. constitutions in March of 2020. All right, well, simple enough, but what can we do about it? Now, Senator Dan Foreman co-chairs the committee that met earlier this week, and he says that officials had the best of intentions when they ordered churches to close, but that the freedom to gather and worship cannot be limited. And I do like his explanation. I think Representative Foreman did justice to this when he said, if they are inalienable rights, that means you and I can never be separated from those rights. But they still did it, right? I mean, we can agree on that. Senator Ron Taylor from Ketchum says, well, he thinks the state went too far at times, but he disagrees that temporarily shutting down churches violated the First Amendment right to practice religion. Well, why would he say that? If it's wrong to shut them down, why would it not be wrong? Well, he says, we just said we're closing houses of worship, and all houses of worship were treated equally. Okay, let me run that through the translator here. As long as the tyranny is being applied equally, then it must be okay. That sound about right? I'm not so sure that I could buy off on that. But anyway, let's continue. As much as the court would relish the opportunity to address issues of religious freedom, free speech, assembly, travel, and the other matters presented in this case, the issue is moot. That was federal district court judge David Nye. He wrote that in a 2021 opinion, dismissing a case that was filed by at least one group. I know there were others who sued the state over the lockdowns and the overreaction. And the judge is saying, well, you know, it's a moot issue. We opened things back up. But listen to what he says next. And this should at least raise an eyebrow. There might come a day when this pandemic or another dire situation could cause severe restrictions of many constitutional and other legal rights, not just religious and travel ones. Well, in the first place, our religious and travel rights are basic human rights, okay? They're inherent. They're not legal. They're not constitutional. as in they weren't given to us by the Constitution, nor were they given to us by the legal system. They are natural rights that both of those systems, constitutional and legal, are supposed to protect. There's a big difference. And the judge says that could be a grave day for liberty, but those are situations for future days and future cases. In other words, the very same infrastructure and the very same people in many cases who were allowed to stand on your rights and deny you those natural rights may do it again, but that's another situation for a future day and future cases. That does not give me a lot of confidence that anybody has effectively caught the vision that this isn't not just, it's not just not supposed to happen again, it cannot happen again. Now, Representative Rob Beiswinger from Horseshoe Bend said, look, I don't know if anyone ever thought when they wrote the U.S. Constitution, we would need to write a provision in there that we're allowed to go into business. He said it even got to the point where neighbors were reporting each other to a state tip line he called the snitch line. Now, they put this in the scare quotes, Boise State Public Radio, because, the snitch line, why would you call it that? Because people were calling and snitching on their neighbors and trying to get the police to arrest their neighbors, which, by the way, they did in some cases. So let's not pretend that was a good thing. Now, this is kind of disheartening, but again, the study committee's votes fell mainly along the party divide. The group unanimously found the state violated the law when it created an advisory group that initially spent emergency federal funds. In other words, the executive branch was spending money or appropriating money that the legislature should have been appropriating, even though it came from the federal government. That's stepping over the bounds of what they're supposed to be able to do properly within their within their executive power. But, and this is the last sentence here, this is the one that actually should leave you feeling a little disappointed. Lawmakers did not propose any sanctions on the governor or other state officials with their findings. Yeah, they did something wrong, but what are you going to do? Do we do it and say it? Boys will be boys, girls will be girls. I don't know. That's not very satisfactory. What's to prevent them from doing it again? It's kind of like the judge is saying, well, it's something for another day. Now, Idaho News says that the Idaho COVID-19 Response Study Committee, tasked with reviewing the state's pandemic response, debated 6 key questions focusing on the constitutionality of measures such as the closure of houses of worship and businesses, as well as statewide quarantine orders. The committee determined that during the closure of churches from March 2020 until May of that year, during Idaho's multi-stage reopening, that violated both the state code and the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. They decided this on an 8-2 vote, so not everybody was on board. Okay, fair enough. And again, that fell mostly along party lines. Similarly, the closure of businesses and the implementation of stay-at-home orders, which started in late March 2020, were found to have violated the constitutional rights in a 9-1 vote. Lawmakers argued that these measures led to inequitable economic outcomes for those forced to stay home. Yeah, right. You can't operate your business, but hey, good luck, keeping your family afloat. Additionally, the committee questioned the legality of quarantining asymptomatic COVID-19 patients and the decision to close schools, ultimately finding those actions unconstitutional by an 8-2 vote. And while emergency extensions were deemed unconstitutional, the dispersal of federal support funds was found to likely violate state codes. So again, these are 2 different news sources, not, by the way, conservative news sources by any stretch, but they're nonetheless reporting, yeah, the violations were found. So, what do you do about it? Well, I like what Idaho GOP chairwoman Dorothy Moon says about this. First of all, she asks, do you remember where you were when President Trump issued his 15 days to slow the spread? Do you remember what you were doing when Governor Little issued his stay-at-home order? Do you remember what life was like in 2020? And her point here is well taken. Too many people have forgotten. They've forgotten how government closed churches but kept liquor stores open. They've forgotten that mom and pop shops were destroyed through no fault of their own, but through the dictates of government bureaucrats. They've forgotten the men and women in Moscow who were arrested for singing hymns outside without masks. They've forgotten the Meridian mom who was arrested for taking her kids to the park. Okay, not all of us have forgotten, but yeah, largely that's in the past. Why would we revisit that? Dorothy says, watching the hearing, I was disappointed to see Democrats on the committee repeatedly making excuses for this oversight. Ron Taylor, I think she may be looking in your direction. They claimed we didn't know how bad COVID would be. They argued the state had a compelling interest in shutting down businesses and forcing people to stay home. And they worried that legislation protecting individual rights might prevent the government from safeguarding public health in the future. And she's blunt here. That's a load of bunk. The entire point of our constitutional protections is to prevent government from infringing on God-given rights. If officials can make an exception in an emergency, there's nothing to stop them from inventing new emergencies to justify their hunger for power and control. Bingo. She nailed it. So what do we do moving forward? Well, Dorothy says Idaho has made great strides in restoring freedom since the dark days of 2020. Republican legislators passed laws protecting medical freedom, prohibiting mask mandates, limiting the power of health districts. This last session was actually quite a great one. But she says we still have work to do. We cannot forget what happened. And in the 2026 session, let's ensure that no government official can ever again strip away our rights like they did 5 years ago. She's right. And there are people who are on your side. And I would encourage you, go to idahofreedom.org and you can learn more about the health freedom legislation that was passed in this last session. You'll see there are numerous other articles dealing with the missteps of government stepping beyond its legitimate powers and the damage that resulted. But more importantly, are you informed enough? Do you care enough to have a line that has to be drawn and cannot be crossed, that government must hold to in order to operate within its proper role? If you're not so sure about what that might be, well, maybe it's time to do a little bit of study. But for those of us who had a line back in 2020, I assure you, it's become a trench at this point. Let's not wait for the next emergency to be an excuse to abuse government power. Our motto should be never again. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.